right. None of us is always right. I think I do have a perspective informed by several decades of experience in this area. I also just want to say, we are in this terrible pandemic now, and I suspect that if we were not in the pandemic, I'm imagining that you guys might be in Sacramento doing a lobby day or something, and I might be speaking to you in person, and I hope that we can do that in the future in person. I know that we will be able to. I think in this pandemic, what we are seeing, I think there has been a narrative that because of the pandemic, we don't need to add a bunch of housing anymore. That we somehow demand for housing is going to be permanently lower. That everyone's going to work from home, so we don't need to build infill housing, and so on and so forth. I disagree with those contentions. I don't think that COVID has changed anything about our need for significantly more housing and our need to make sure that that housing is environmentally sustainable and not fueling sprawl and climate change and wildfires. We certainly will have some differences, I'm sure, although I think it's too soon to say coming out of COVID. But in my view, it does not change the need for having a better housing policy. And that, in my view, California for about 50 years has had a policy of discouraging new housing. We used to build enough housing for the people who needed it in California back in the 50s and 60s when we were really growing by leaps and bounds. But over the last 50 years, we have methodically adopted policies, anti-housing policies, to make it harder and harder and harder to build housing. So as our population has grown, our housing production has, with only a few exceptional periods, collapsed. And the same is true today. And we see the results. We see the results in terms of the cost of housing, where people's kids can't afford to live in the community where they grew up, where people, if they lose their housing for whatever reason, have nowhere to go. We've seen the fact that California has 13% of the national population, but 25% of the homeless population. We see it in the growth of supercommuters and of people leaving our state entirely. It's just not sustainable economically. It's not sustainable in terms of the diversity of our state, and it's certainly not sustainable environmentally as more and more people have to live further and further from where they work and in communities where they can't walk or use transit or get around in any way except by driving a car. I also want to say, I know there's a lot of discussion about local control versus state control. And I think in a way, it's an unfortunate dichotomy. This isn't about one group having control or another group having control. It's about how do we achieve the best results. And I bet you if you go around to voters or residents, people who aren't as engaged in the nitty gritty of these policy debates, and say, ask them about who should be making decisions about housing. I think most people really could care less whether it is a city council member or a mayor or a state legislator or a governor making this, that, or the other decision about housing. What they want is for housing to be more available and more affordable. I think people are very focused on the result, having housing that is more available and affordable, and not on whether the city council makes this decision or whether the state legislature sets that standard. And so I think it's important for all of us not to get so caught up in whether it's a local or a state decision.
Well, Senator,
that we lose sight of.
Interrupt you. Actually, what you're saying is just a great segue for a lot of the questions that our members are dying to ask you. So your remarks are just perfect, and I'm sorry to interrupt you because I think a lot of your remarks would directly answer those questions. So if you don't mind, we can get started on that, and you can elaborate if that's okay in the interest of time.
Sure.
Thank you so much. And I will turn that to Julie.
Okay, thank you. And boy, Senator, we've had the opportunity to speak several times, and it's always interesting. And it does lead me into the first question that I will ask. And you did anticipate a good amount of things that we want to talk to you about. So today, we want to ask you about the false narrative that places blame on cities for economic and market forces that cannot be corrected by zoning and unfunded mandates. These actions will only rob our next generation from raising their families in thoughtful, balanced communities. Cities across California are faced with the 6th RHNA cycle, which has produced housing allocations far exceeding the 5th cycle, and which research shows is artificially inflated by greater than 100%. These mandates are unrealistic. Cities don't have the funding that is required to subsidize the volume of affordable housing needed to make our RHNA numbers. Bonds that increase property taxes make housing more unaffordable. Inclusionary requirements of 10 to 20% increase costs and also can't create the number of units mandated. More market rate housing does not lead to more affordability. And indeed, the Building Industry Association says they can't build the new allocations. In giving cities unfunded mandates without the tools to succeed, is the state scapegoating cities because it does not want to fund affordable housing?
So you've said a lot. You've said a lot of things there. I agree with some of the things you've said. I disagree with some other things that you said. I think that the notion that supply and demand don't apply to housing is something I disagree with. And I think the proof of that is that when California used to build a lot more housing was more available to people. And we've seen time and time again that cities, places that allow more housing to be built and that build more housing, that costs become stabilized. But that part of what you said, I fundamentally disagree with. So what I do want to say is that I try to be really, none of us is perfect. I try to be really careful and intentional about this when I talk about housing. Housing, this is not about demonizing cities. It is not about demonizing city council members. As I like to say, don't hate, God, I have not, it's the pandemic scrambles up a lot of the
COVID brain, we all have it.
Yeah,
yes.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully, yeah. You know, to hate the game, don't hate the player. It escaped me for a second. Hate the game, don't hate the player. This is, you know, I know city council members up and down the state. I know planning commissioners and planning directors and mayors from big cities and small cities and everywhere in between. And overwhelmingly, the local elected and appointed officials that I know are doing this work because they want to do right by their community and they want to get it right, and they work really hard, and they could be doing a lot of other things with their time, and they're getting paid little to nothing, and they're doing it because they're passionate about their community. And so I don't like it when local elected and appointed officials get demonized. We can have disagreements, but it's not about demonizing. And I don't think that what's happening today is because cities or local electeds have gone into this, you know, saying, let's make housing really expensive. It's not about like the players. It's about the system and the game that we have set up. And we have set up a system that is designed to fail. And it was both in terms of rules from the state level and local rules, and layering on all of these restrictions on housing. You have a system that's designed to fail. And we tell cities, we want you under RHNA to approve all of this housing. And in my view, the RHNA numbers are actually good. I think that they are appropriate and good. Prior RHNA cycles, you know, some of the cities had outrageously low numbers that did not even vaguely correspond with projected housing need over an 8-year period. But we say that, and then we make it really hard to actually build that housing. And it's hard for a few reasons. You're right. The state needs to provide a lot more housing when it comes, a lot more funding when it comes to affordable housing. We took away redevelopment. Not when I say we, I was not in office then, and I disagree with that. There were abuses of redevelopment that should have been fixed instead of taking the whole thing away. And I would like to see a version of redevelopment come back focused on affordable housing. And I've supported various measures, some of which have been vetoed, to bring that back. So I am very supportive of that. I've supported various revenue measures and general fund sources and bonds to get more affordable housing funding for cities. So that's one way where the state, in collaboration with local funding measures and regional funding measures, needs to step up with more funding. But we also, I think, set up for failure by saying that the way we're going to approve projects is that city councils have to go out every week and make discretionary decisions about zoning compliant projects, and potentially put themselves at peril. And that's some of the work that we've tried to do around streamlining and ministerial approval, because city council members should not have to be in that position week in and week out. So there are a number of things we have to do to help city councils succeed, instead of putting on mandates and then not helping them succeed.
Thank
So
you.
glad you said that, because certainly, yes, we do, my peers and myself do feel that we have been set up to fail, but we would still disagree with many of the points that you made there in what causes the unaffordability of housing. But thank you for that response, Senator. I am going to ask Michael Barnes to introduce himself and ask our next question. You're on mute, Michael. There you go.
I just want to check in with Oscar. I know he was pressed for time. I'm sorry to. Are you still there, Oscar?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you wait 5 more minutes?
Well, it
Yeah,
would be
yes,
it would be
yes.
about 15 minutes before Oscar. Is that okay, Oscar?
Yeah, that's cool. That'll work.
Great,
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks. All right, where'd I go? Oh, there I am. All right. Hi, Senator Wiener. My name is Michael Barnes. I'm a former elected in Albany, and I'm kind of a cranky technocrat. Used to be a state budget analyst. So I want to set the stage broadly with this question, and it's going to take about 90 seconds. So my apologies, let me get going. Mr. Wiener, according to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, California has a statewide shortage of 1.5 million housing units for extremely low and very low income residents. So for context, let me give you some cost figures. In urban coastal California, affordable housing costs around $750,000 per unit. The city of Carson in LA County was able to refurbish an existing apartment building for moderate income tenants at a cost of $500,000 per unit. And according to Cal Matters, that was a Matt Levine story, a Project Homekey motel conversion runs about $350,000 per unit. So let's just assume statewide, to keep the numbers round, we could build affordable housing units at a cost of $500,000 per unit. Building 1.5 million units would cost $750 billion, which is 4.5 times the governor's 2021 budget request. Now, alternatively, if we used inclusionary housing at a 20% standard, then 1 in 5 units would be affordable. But to build 1.5 million affordable units, we would have to build 7.5 million housing units, which is about 4 to 5 times the highest reasonable estimates of housing need for the next several years. So the scale of the problem is huge. And I know, Bell's SB5 and, other measures were well intended, but given these huge costs, how do you suggest the state approach funding of affordable housing?
And Senator, you did share some of it, but now that Michael has kind of, again, challenged the real affordability of some of the methods that you were describing, how do you respond to what he said?
Well, what I will say is, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate you doing that calculation, because I think that the number that you put out there, and whatever, people can do calculations and cost estimates in different ways, and regardless, the number is very large, regardless, whether it's 750 billion or 500 billion or a trillion or whatever the case may be. And absolutely, we need, we used to in this country dramatically invest, including from the federal government, in what we used to call public housing. Now we call it affordable housing or social housing. We need to move back in that direction and understand that housing is a public good, and government at all levels, we need to be significantly investing in housing, and it's not going to happen overnight. We have dug ourselves into such a deep hole for so long, including around the funding of affordable housing, that it's not something that you're going to, like, in one budget cycle or even 5 budget cycles, dig yourself out of. So we have to do that. But I think the other aspect of it, in terms of Michael's question, was that we hear sometimes, and I read it on your website, and you said it, I think, a little bit today, Julie, that we don't want market rate housing, we want only affordable housing. And I'm probably overstating your position, but we hear that argument quite a bit, that we need affordable housing, not market rate housing. And that argument, even though I'm a big believer in massive investment in affordable housing and dramatically ramping up for extremely low, very low income people, it is the idea that we're going to solve the housing affordability crisis exclusively through building subsidized affordable housing, unless we have a complete transformation in the entire economy of this country and how we view government. It's a setup for failure, because it's going to take us a very, very long time to get that level of investment in place. We need to try, but that's not by itself the solution, and it will ensure a perpetual severe shortage. And we need to acknowledge that in California today, 90% of low income people in California live in market rate housing, 90%. Even if we were to dramatically increase our investment in affordable housing, and let's say triple the amount of affordable housing we have in California, and that would be a big deal, to triple our entire affordable housing stock in California, that would still leave 70% of low-income Californians living in market rate housing. And so when we say we don't want more market rate housing, that is absolutely a way of saying we want a perpetual shortage, and that a large majority of low-income people are not going to have housing that they can ever hope to afford. And so I think we need to also be clear about that, because the number that Michael put out, which I'm not disputing, it's a range, but that is somewhere within the range, shows both the work we have to do in funding over the long run, but also over time, that is not going to be a solution by itself, because the numbers are too big.
Okay, and thank you for that response. And I am going to kind of step out of turn here, and because you misrepresent, I think, the position that most cities are taking. What we recognize is that there has
I didn't say most cities.
Okay.
I said what I read on your website,
Okay.
and what some people argue. I did not say most cities. Most cities do not dispute the need for market rate housing.
Our concern is that market rate housing is pretty easy to achieve, and we've all exceeded our requirements of market rate. My city's overachieved market rate substantially, but not our affordability, because the affordability requires that subsidy that we're not, as you pointed out, went away in 2011. And our neighboring city exceeded their market rate by 550%. And we definitely see the trend being toward market rate profits, and the focus is that there isn't a shortage there. There's, in fact, many cities have a glut of that market rate housing, but what we need is the help to get the affordability.
Yeah. Okay, so what I will say is I agree that you need more help for affordable housing. You and I are totally aligned on that. I do not agree that there's a glut of market rate housing. We have a severe shortage of housing at every income level. The reason by exceeding the RHNA, it's because the RHNA numbers for many, many cities were very low. Even with those low RHNA numbers, most cities do not meet their market rate RHNA. But when you have cities that have RHNA goals of 3 or 5 or 10 or 100 units for an 8-year period, that is not a reasonable housing allocation. Say you need to build 100 or 50 or 150 units over 8 years. And so I know there are a lot of cities that are unhappy with the new RHNA numbers, but they are more aligned with the scale of the crisis that we are in terms of the severe housing shortage at every single income level.
And of course, there's research that shows that that isn't the case, but I don't want to shortchange the other questions that other people have spent time preparing. And we're just going to have you back because we need to develop that a little bit further. So I am going to ask Lynetta, do you mind if we ask Oscar to go ahead? So because he seems to have a deadline and would hate to miss his, so I'm just going to go out of order just a little bit. And Oscar, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and share your message and your question with the senator.
Yes. Thank you very much. Senator, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
My name is Oscar de la Torre. I served on the school board here in Santa Monica, Malibu for 18 years, and I was just elected to the city council. I was elected just in November. So I'm finishing my first term on the city council. Well, starting my first term on the city council. But more importantly, I grew up in the Pico neighborhood in Santa Monica. It's the lower income part of the city. A lot of people don't know about it, but there is a working class, or what used to be a working class, and it's changing dramatically like every day. But it's an ethnic enclave. You know, if you drive down the 10 freeway, you go to the beach, the 10 freeway split our neighborhood in half back in the early 60s. Racially segregated. We had, protective covenants and deed restrictions that, created a situation where most of the African-American and Latino residents in the city live in the Pico neighborhood in R1 and also, in apartments and so forth. A lot of renters as well. Part of the concern that we have is how do we protect these communities? How do we protect the diversity of these communities, of the city of Santa Monica? And what we've seen is, the growth of more market and moderate rate housing has created more market pressures and has increased housing overall. And we've lost more affordable housing. There's a mapping project that shows like how many, I think it's been like 2,000 people have been Ellised out, just in like the last 10 years. So in any case, we have just seen, the elimination of housing overall with these policies, the trickle down theory, it didn't work out, and it's pushed out a lot of residents and displaced people. So one of the things that we know that it's obvious that adding supply and the way that we've experienced it is not actually increasing, the affordable housing. And so we want to know like how these policies, I mean, we're concerned that the R1 zones and the more working class parts of the city are the ones that are going to really be, developed, right? And the more higher income R1 zones in the city are going to be untouched, by these types of policies. So we want to find a way to stay in these communities, like families that bought homes, people of color that have been in Santa Monica for years, and we want to continue to live here. And so we just want to know what is the plan to prevent, the more rapid gentrification of these communities? Well, how do we keep within expanding affordable housing? How do we keep our residents that are lifelong residents living in Santa Monica?
No, thank you for that, and congratulations on your election. So a couple of things. First of all, for people who own their homes, no one's going to be forced to. I'm unaware of any policies that will force people to sell their homes. So
it's not the forcing. It's just what'll happen is once the value goes up, people start selling, and so one person does it, it's like a domino effect on that.
No, I understand.
They start selling,
I understand, but in terms of people being displaced, there's a difference between renters who are forced out and owners who are not forced to sell their homes, and they may at some point decide that they want to sell their home. In terms of renters, I've been a supporter of Ellis Act reform, Costa-Hawkins reform. We have to reduce the sort of speculative pressures in terms of the evictions that we see, the flipping. In every housing bill that I author, we put strong anti-displacement measures in around demolitions, around parcels that have had renters living on it within a certain number of years are not even eligible. So we've tried to do things, and we've worked with equity groups on these anti-displacement protections, because I think it's very important. It's about adding housing, not replacing existing communities. We also have, worked on different ideas around significantly delayed implementation in communities that are at greater risk of gentrification and displacement. So there's no perfect tool, there's and no one's, I think, thought of what the perfect tool is to prevent that. But we have tried to come up with approaches to try to reduce that pressure. And I also,
one more.
Sorry
to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt because I have to run. But I just want to say this, that it'll create more flipping. Like, and every time there's a flip, the new owners, they have an incentive to make their money, right? And so they start harassing tenants. I mean, there's just a big impact overall when you see these policies implemented. We've seen it in Santa Monica. It does not help protect those,
but I think
communities, low-income communities.
Councilman, I think we also need to acknowledge that these pressures and the speculation and the flipping and the evictions, unfortunately, have been happening for a very long time, long before any of these housing policies were even thought of in the legislature. These have been happening. There's a reason why your city and my city both adopted rent control in 1979, and why a lot of people it wasn't random. That was because this was even happening back then, even though we weren't building much housing. And so the pushing out of communities, the displacement, gentrification, the flipping, the speculation has been happening for decades and decades because of the scarcity of housing. And so I think that is a broader issue that is not just because the legislature for the last few years has passed some laws. That's not what's causing this. It's been happening for a very, very long time.
All right, Oscar, thank you so much. And we know that you really made a sacrifice from your family to be here today. Thank you. Sorry for the impatience.
Thank you. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm also going to make an announcement that we normally do our meetings in a different format, in a Zoom format, and tried to do this in a way to be more clean and appropriate for you, Senator Wiener, knowing that we would in fact have a large turnout. And we apparently miscalculated, not realizing that this format has a limit. And we have apparently quite a few participants trying to get in and they're unable to. We've reached our limit. So all I can say is I apologize to everyone who can't get on this call. We know a lot of other people are trying to. We'll have to do better next time. But hey, you're a popular guy, Scott. We really appreciate it.
Or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So I'm going to ask our next speaker, Lynetta, to introduce herself and ask her question. We're going kind of in a different direction. We've got a whole bunch of directions for you. So we're gonna just go all over the place.
Hello, Senator Wiener. Just so glad to speak with you. My name is Lynetta Smith McElroy, and I am a public school librarian. My question touches a bit about what Oscar said, but mine is a little bit more specific. Mr. Wiener, I own a home in Leimert Park, in the Leimert Park community in South Los Angeles. Leimert Park is a historical majority African-American neighborhood, the center of Black culture and art in Los Angeles. My family, my husband and I, navigated many unfair systemic obstacles to buy our home. Nevertheless, we had maintained our home with the intended purpose of creating generational wealth like homeowners across the country. As a community activist, I work to maintain my neighborhood's identity, value, and unique character. Some of your supporters accuse homeowners like me, who live in areas zoned for single-family homes, of participating in exclusionary zoning. Moreover, we've heard your supporters say that the purpose of removing single-family zones is to provide a remedy for past discrimination in housing. That proposed solution reverses the gains of families like mine. More simply, it is a state-sanctioned transfer of wealth from families like mine to global investors. Mr. Wiener, do you think I'm excluding anyone in my neighborhood? Do you think I am a racist?
No, absolutely not. And I've never said that. What we've talked about in terms of single family zoning, and I think sometimes when people talk about the debates about single family zoning, it's pitched in this: should there be single family homes or should there not be single family homes? I grew up in a single family home that my parents purchased when I was 3 years old, and it was the first home that they owned after they had rented for many, many, many years, and it was a big deal. We also, right down the street from us, had a multi-unit building, and it was fine. That didn't take away from our single family home. So there will always be a huge demand for single family homes. Single family homes are always going to be very important. And although there are some people who, as you know, in this world, people have a lot of different views and ideas. My view is that single family homes are important, but we should, in addition to having single family homes, allow multi-unit. And that
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, Senator. Senator, excuse me, please. What you were saying, sir, do you understand what I was saying? It is not just some single family zone in some other area, sir. This is the seat of African American culture in my area, but there's other areas in California like this too. Once apartments go up in this kind of area, that is the end of a lot of the generational wealth that could have been accumulated by that family. You have to understand, sir, we have a whole different idea about home ownership. My grandfather, my great-grandfather was a slave, and my grandfather was a shareholder, a sharecropper, if I might say. So and there are other people in this neighborhood, and that's their same story. And so when you have apartment buildings, 12 and 20 units next to a home, that denigrates the entire area. We don't have this kind of area just anywhere. There are few areas. And that is why we feel we should be preserved and that single family zones matter, because we should matter.
Well, and a lot of the work that's happened also, there are strict anti-demolition controls so that you're not coming in and just knocking down homes to build multi-unit. In addition, historic districts receive significant protection. And so I think, we're trying to, it's trying to take a number of different needs into account. And I've been in your neighborhood before. It is an amazing neighborhood. And thank you for the work that you have done to, make it even better than it already is. And I appreciate that. And like I said, I've done a lot of neighborhood work in my neighborhood, and I'm not in any way denigrating that. But we do have a severe housing shortage. And so, we have to find a way to thread that needle about how do we protect neighborhoods and make sure that people can live in the neighborhood that they bought into, while also making sure that we have enough housing. And in many, many single family neighborhoods throughout the state, and I'm not saying every single family neighborhood is the same. I don't believe that. I don't think that's true. But there are many, many single family neighborhoods that, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they were affordable for a working class person to buy a home, and they no longer are. And so people are not able to access that. And so it is a real problem. And I always welcome, if people have alternative solutions, I'm always open to listening to those. But the status quo is very challenging for a lot of people now when we look at so many people struggling with housing in the state.
Yes, thank you so much, Senator. And part of the problem is that we're saying removing the zoning. That is the issue, because many times the apartments could be constructed on the commercial corridors, not obtaining a home, leveling it, and then putting 12 to 20 units on that in that block. And thank you so much for your response. I have one other quick question, and that is, do you feel that removing single family zoning rather than fully funding quality education and providing business opportunities for Black Californians will address historical discrimination in housing?
I think they both can. And I could add and you and I could probably come up with a much longer list of things that we need to do. And COVID has been a really painful reminder of those inequities in education and healthcare and housing and all sorts of other arenas. And so I think the answer is there are a number of different areas that need to be addressed to achieve that equity. Housing is one of them. Investment in education is absolutely one of them. And so I think it's both.
Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you.
And if I could just say one thing, because you said, use the word raise at the end. In all of the housing bills that I've authored, we have put strong anti-demolition controls in those bills. That's something I sometimes get criticized from the other side, from the more YIMBY-ish side, for having demolition controls that some view as too strong. And I defend those demolition controls, and I stand by them, because my view is we should not be going into neighborhoods and knocking down a whole bunch of housing to build other housing. That's not the right way to do it. Redevelopment in San Francisco, for example, where we tore down entire neighborhoods, did not work. It was a terrible, horrible failure. And fortunately, it was stopped before it could destroy and tear down other neighborhoods. But a lot of damage was done, including to our one of our historically Black communities in the Fillmore. And we need to not be doing that. And that's why I always put demolition restrictions and bans in my bills.
And, you know, Senator, it's wonderful that you know San Francisco and you know the neighborhoods of San Francisco and what's appropriate there. You do not understand all of our communities. And that's why it is our responsibility to make those decisions and to look at our communities.
So Julie, I appreciate that. And you know, here's what I will say. First of all, for anyone who thinks that I just sort of sit up on some imperial throne and do housing bills, that's not true. We work with a statewide coalition, people in communities all over the state. And so it's not the case that this is like one person in one city who's, pretends to know everything about every community in the state. I don't know everything about every community in the state. No one does. And that's why you have to work in coalition so that you're getting all of that information. In addition, but I do want to say, the state legislature makes policy for the entire state of California, and nothing passes unless 21 senators and 41 assembly members and a governor elected by everyone agree to it. So you don't have one representative who just issues policy. It has to pass the majority of both houses. And so that represents perspectives from all over the state. When there was a senator from Los Angeles County who authored a law that I voted for, and it was very controversial, to say that schools could not start before 8:30 a.m. You may have heard of that. It was a very controversial bill. I supported it for 2 years in a row because I thought it was the right policy, and I thought he was correct in his view. That applies to the San Francisco Unified School District, just like it applies to the Los Angeles Unified School District or the Pleasanton School District or anywhere else. And I don't remember anyone attacking him for saying, you don't know about my community. It was a group effort from around the state, and that's how state legislation works. So I just want to put that out there.
And the state originally gave local control to local municipalities, but we're not going to get to the other questions. So there are so many things I'd like to sit down and promise that you're going to come back, because there are so many things that we would like to follow up on there. I'm going to ask the next speakers to consider what your most important questions are, since we're probably not going to get to all of them. So I am going to turn the next question over again to Michael.
Okay. I just want to say, Senator, I don't want to get into this, but I was in the room when SB 827 went down in the Housing and Transportation Committee back in the spring of 2018. And I don't remember there being much in the way of preservation in that bill. But
there was quite a bit, but
moving on. You assume that neighborhoods reduce greenhouse gas production and are better for the environment. Studies in Chicago and several Australian cities have shown that urban and suburban living have similar energy usage if you include the indirect energy requirements of large building and other urban infrastructure and amenities. In order to fight climate change, we have to electrify transportation and heating, space heating and water heating. With a cleaner grid, heat pumps, and electric vehicles, along with working from home, there's even less argument for the environmental benefits of high-density housing. Given this, what is your argument for the environmental benefits of more high-density housing?
Well, I know it was an oversimplification, but when people are driving long distances and having to drive everywhere they go, that is going to increase carbon emissions. When we are covering up farmland and open space and building more and more freeways and widening freeways and building into wildfire zones, that has severe climate and environmental impacts. And I don't think you can lump all suburbs together. It depends where places are located. And there are a lot of suburbs that are very close to job centers that may have public transportation access. And so it's not all the same in terms of environmental impacts. What I do know is that if your housing policy is, we don't want to build where we are, just build out further and further and further and further, that becomes environmentally destructive. It absolutely does, in terms of wildfires, in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of destroying wild space and forested areas and farmland, et cetera. And we do know that the more you build further and further out, energy usage absolutely goes up, water usage per capita goes up. You have to build more and more electric transmission infrastructure, which then increases wildfire risk. You have to build more water infrastructure further and further and further and further out, which is much more expensive per person because people aren't living closer together, and the inner suburbs tend to be denser than the outer suburbs. And so, I think that there is enormous evidence that sprawl is a very energy intensive, water intensive, environmentally problematic endeavor. And I agree, we do need to electrify everything. I'm a proponent of that, but that's not where we are.
Okay, well, I'm good. Why don't we move on?
All right. Lynetta, if you could make your next one go for it.
Yes, all right. Okay, one more question on the environment. On the subject of environmental harm caused by upzoning, trees will be removed to make way for construction of larger apartment buildings. Your proposed housing legislation requires removal of front, back, and side yards. With less permeable landscaping for water retention, runoff becomes more polluted, contributing to the poisoning of our local lakes, rivers, and ocean. The rapid flooding of storm drains leads to raw sewage spills in places like the West Portal neighborhood in San Francisco that we experienced last year. Moreover, with the reduction of trees and other plants along with global warming, cities will become almost unbearable hotspots. Senator Wiener, how will the destruction of our city green spaces due to upzoning lend itself to the reduction of greenhouse gases and create a healthier environment?
Can you clarify which law bill you were referring to when you talk about setbacks? Because I've not authored any bills about setbacks.
The genre of housing legislation, when homes are, let's say, raised and removed, the apartments that are built do not have to have any kind of setback, which means that they can build right up to the sidewalk.
No, that's not my bill. There might be another bill you're thinking of, or a local requirement. That's not my bill. My bill didn't change the setbacks to say you can build lot line to lot line. I've never authored a bill that did that. So I don't know what you're referring to. And if you want to, if there's a specific provision in a bill you want me to respond to, that's fine. I'm happy to do that. But I have not authored a bill that allowed that.
We know your recent, maybe it wasn't yours. The ADU bills have shorter setbacks, and so we've definitely seen some different legislation.
So you're talking about state legislation around setbacks, not my bill. I just think it's really important to, I don't author all the state housing laws.
I think,
in fact, the large majority of them are not authored by me.
Right. I think Lynetta's was a general reference to the concept of the concept of high density is not more energy efficient, and the concerns that will follow.
So, yeah.
And excuse me, Thank you so much, Julie and Senator. But I may say that this is a problem that we're already having, not in my particular neighborhood, but 2 miles over. We already have where homes are being removed, and there's apartment buildings that are put in place, removing the landscaping, including the city trees. That's the backyard tree that once owned by the, and I know that this is not your particular bill, but I would like you to speak on, perhaps you could get a flavor of what we will lose when we lose our trees and green spaces, if you please would respond. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I don't, again, in terms of what the specific situations you're referring to, I don't know what those are, but that sounds like it could be local rules around land use and what's allowed in terms of housing. And I found that sometimes people will come to me and say, you did a law that allowed this in my community. And when we look at it, it's like, no, it was the local zoning or setbacks or whatever that allowed it. And it is what it is. But the fundamental point that you're raising is the need for urban greenery and urban forest, which I agree. Urban forests are unbelievably important. It's not just a matter of climate change and absorbing carbon, but it cleans the air in general. We have studies that children who are in school that look outside and see a tree do better. We know people's mental health, like greenery is incredibly important for so many reasons. And that's why when I was on the Board of Supervisors, actually San Francisco, we had a really bad system where street trees were the responsibility of homeowners, which meant we had a decaying urban forest because that was dumped on the homeowners. I authored a ballot measure to force the city to actually maintain those trees. And now we're seeing an expanding urban forest in San Francisco. And so we need to be doing more to get more trees. And that's not to say that a tree can't ever be removed for any reason. When a tree is removed, it needs to be replaced. I have landmark trees in San Francisco, so they couldn't be removed. So I'm a believer in that, and that's something that we have to be mindful of. That doesn't mean that no tree can ever be removed.
Sure.
We have to be mindful of it.
Thank you for that. And we do need to move on to the next question. I did want to just point out that, of course, one of the bills that is quite controversial right now is SB 9, and you're a co-author, I believe. And I think that allows for very limited setbacks of 4 foot or something. But let's go on to the next question. And I'm going to, again, change the order a little bit too, because I'm concerned that we're not going to get to everything. And I'm going to give Peggy the opportunity to come forward with the next question. Peggy?
Thank you, Senator, for being so gracious and answering a lot of the questions. And I want to start out with a comment that I know you've been collaborating with a lot of the housing advocates and coalitions. And now that you had a chance to meet us, I hope that you will consider us as part of your coalition of housing advocates, because I think we bring something to the table to help you understand the perspective. And I think that together we can really address the issues that have brought up, rather than, not be able to collaboratively work together and find out later that we could have.
Yeah, and even though we have some disagreements, but that's okay. That's okay. That's a democracy. And as Julie will attest, I have an open door. Julie and I have had many lovely conversations, not just about housing, but about other issues too. And so we always have an open door.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's just often that when people talk about housing, they forget about the local elected. And since we live in the community that we represent, right, because we live in the city we actually represent, then we like to bring something to.
I don't forget about local elected officials ever.
So thank you. And I really appreciate your comment about, funding, because, and your commitment to help cities meet their, especially RENA obligations. And which actually leads to what I want to bring up with another important funding source for the cities as we build is the developers fees. There have been so many proposals, a lot of talk about eliminating developers' fees. But as you recognize, as coming from the local government, cities need that fee to make critical infrastructure improvements or expand the infrastructure. And the state audit actually found that cities have been using the developers' fees appropriately, using it for those infrastructure needs. So if the developer fees are eliminated, as some would like to have happen, and what they pay is so little, I don't think it, personally, my opinion is it won't bring down the cost of housing. But if it's eliminated, will you sponsor a bill or support the concept of having the state backfill those funds so we can build and
Yeah.
repair?
Thank you for that. That's a really important question. And I will say that I come at this as someone who I do believe in impact fees or exactions or whatever you want to call them. And when I was on the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, I authored the legislation that extended San Francisco's transportation impact development fee to residential. It only applied to commercial. And I authored the legislation to extend it to residential. That was a controversial bill, but I thought it was really important. I've also been a supporter of inclusionary and sewer fees or park fees. I think impact fees are important. And I will say this is another situation where California has made it so hard for cities to raise the revenue that they need for basic operations that unfortunately impact fees, development impact fees are in some ways have the fewest obstacles to actually getting them enacted. You don't have to go to the voters. It's just a much easier and efficient way to raise funds. And so cities have become very reliant on development impact fees, probably more reliant than they should be, but that's not the city's fault. That is the fault of the system that we have. What I said before about hate the game, don't hate the player. And so impact fees are important. I'm unaware, I don't support getting rid of impact fees, and I'm unaware of any proposals to do so. I know that Assemblymember Tim Grayson, is he your Assemblymember, Julie, or is that Rebecca Bauer-Cahill? Yeah. So Assemblymember Grayson has been working on this for a few years. I know he has traveled around the state, talked to probably a number of people on this Zoom, tried to have a collaborative process. As far as I know, he's not proposing to get rid of impact fees. I think there are some challenges with massive disparities among some cities. And one of them is in my backyard, where the exactions per door in San Francisco are like something like $165,000. In Oakland, it's like $65,000. That when people see that level of disparity between cities, and we have examples of that around the state, people question that, like why that kind of disparity. So I think what Assemblymember Grayson is trying to do more than anything is just to bring some level of rigor so you don't have those massive disparities. Because if impact fees are too off the charts, that can impact the ability to build housing. So it's not about eliminating impact fees, it's about rationalizing it.
I understand that, but my follow-up, if you don't mind, is the fact that when the disparity be much the reason because of the local conditions. For example, in the city of Los Angeles, in order for them to replace the an 8-year-old system that they have, it would take approximately the next 22 years at the cost of approximately 1.3 billion, somewhere around there. Don't quote me on there, but it was over $1 billion for them to completely do that.
For what system?
For completely their water sewage system. Because it's so old and they have spent so many decades of neglecting it. So one of the problems that they're facing now is with additional density, housing, that system, considering, hydrants, it's actually quite interesting. You'd be driving and all of a sudden the hydrant just busted because something happened underground. So they need to do all those improvements. So the disparity that one might perceive as disparity is maybe localized because they have a bigger infrastructure system or a more aged system, or in San Francisco case where you have sewage and your groundwater all together in one system that really needs to be addressed. Or as we move into one of the things that the Governor Brown had proposed, and I hope Governor Newsom will catch on, is also the recycling of the water, right? Just so that we can reduce groundwater pumping. All that system tied into developers' fees may cause a disparity. So my concern is that idea of trying to equalize costs, it may not.
It's not about equalizing it. It's more about not having such wild disparities. And I'm all for recycled water. I actually authored the law in San Francisco that requires large new development to have on-site water recycling. But in terms of what you raised with water and sewer is a really good example, because LA has that problem. We do in San Francisco too. We have an ancient sewer system and we're gradually replacing it as we resurface streets. But when you talk about an aging water system or sewer system, that's the responsibility of everyone to chip in to help pay for that, because we all benefited from the 150 years and now it's deteriorated and we all benefit from upgrading it. And so I support like sewer, those hookup fees and fees for new development, but I don't think we should like expect new development to be who shoulders the burden of doing. That's a burden for everyone, including the new development, but including existing residents. And part of the challenge is that in California, we have a really messed up taxation system. And it's really hard to change it because there's always going to be winners and losers. And we saw that with Prop 15, which I supported. We should take commercial, large commercial out of Prop 13, and that'll be dramatically beneficial to education, to cities, but it failed. And so we have a tax system that, where we all should be paying for things, whether it's through income tax, property tax, sales tax, whatever. And instead, a lot of it gets put on new development, and some of it should be on new development. But I think sometimes it goes too far. And that's not a criticism of cities. Cities are put in a bad spot in terms of funding these services. We need a better approach to funding municipal services.
Well, thank you for that. And, considering what you said, I hope to have you be more supportive of the cities on a lot of these legislations, so that either instead of the cities working, opposing our state representative, that we work more collaboratively. So thank you.
Senator Wiener, we asked you to join us for an hour. We would love for you to stay a bit longer if you could, but we'll understand if you aren't able to stay with us. We do have more questions. We could take just one or two.
I do have something after this, but one more would be okay. Yeah.
Okay, that is more than fair. So we actually have, I think, 5 more. So I'm going to let Michael choose one more question. And Michael?
Actually, I would like to hear the response to Peggy's next question, frankly.
To which one?
Peggy's next question regarding SB 828.
All right, Peggy, you go.
I'm sorry. Well, actually, Michael, can you read it? Because I just lost my page.
Sure. Mr. Wiener, I spent a few hours last night reading SB 828. I have a question. While drafting SB 828, did you or any members of your staff consult with the Department of Finance Demographics Unit so that you could verify your methodology would build on theirs in a logical and consistent manner? If not, who did you consult with?
SB 828, which was in 2018, so it's a few years back, went through a very, very rigorous process, both legislatively with our committees and committee staff, and also with the executive branch. And the Department of Finance is always involved in addition to HCD in this kind of bill. So this was a very, very thoroughly vetted bill. And the purpose of SB 828, instead of talking in lingo, this was about reforming RHNA, and the goal was to make sure that RHNA reflected actual housing need, and also that whatever the number is for a region, that we try to reduce the politicization of how the numbers get sub-allocated within regions, because we were seeing situations where wealthier, more powerful cities would get lower allocations, and cities that were less wealthy, less powerful would be more. Of course, the most extreme example was Beverly Hills getting a RHNA allocation of, I believe, 2 units 2 units for an
But
8-year
you
period.
don't, the legislature does not control the sub-allocation within.
No, but we created
That's up to ABAG or SCAG.
No, but SB 828 created more guardrails so that that kind of abuse did not happen. So SB 828 didn't micromanage and say what your allocation is, but it created guardrails to prevent politically powerful cities from shoving off their RENA allocations to less politically powerful cities, which is what.
Have you ever talked to the demographers at the Department of Finance who have historically done these projections?
Have I personally
Or
talked to
someone on your
demographers?
staff?
I don't know. I know we communicated with the Department of Finance, and I don't know if it was the demographers that they spoke to.
Okay, that's it for me. Thanks.
Okay. And yes, 828 is proving to be having some interesting consequences, certainly. Senator, thank you so much for your time. And we thank you for being so generous with your time and answering our questions, and know that some of them were difficult. But I believe we're all leaving this conversation with a better understanding of one another's, as I think you and I often have in the past. So we look forward to having a working relationship. We'd love to invite you back and follow up on some of the things we didn't have time to discuss in more depth. And so if you have any final comments for us, I would love for you to.
I would say thank you for taking time on a Sunday. I appreciate it. I know we have some agreements, we have some disagreements, and I'm sure when we get outside of housing, I bet you we have an enormous number of agreements, mental health being one of them, as you mentioned, Julie. And what I will say is, first of all, if you can't take a hard question, you shouldn't be in politics. So that's I think that's sort of a very fundamental thing. So I don't mind hard questions, even if they're uncomfortable. And I know that overwhelmingly that we all want the same end result. We want California, where people can afford to live here and people can make lives for themselves, and this state can be the amazing, creative, innovative, beautiful place it's always been. Sometimes we have disagreements about how to get there, but we all want to get to the same end. And so I would say let's try to find common ground, because there's always common ground. So thank you for having me today.
All right. Well, thanks again. It was a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Senator.
And we look forward to that follow-up.
And Lynetta, thank you for being a librarian. I will say that one of my greatest sadnesses about public education is the sort of librarian, school counselors, school nurses have been really decimated over the years, and you all play, librarians are so critical. There are librarians who were super formative for me when I was a kid. So we need to fix that too. That's a separate conversation, I know.
Yes, thank you. Please fully fund libraries for all schools.
And school nurses,
Okay.
yes.
That too. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Senator
Thank you,
Wiener.
Julie.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
everyone.
Wiener.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye. So
Senator.
For the rest, since we don't have the ability to have two-way dialogue, I think we're going to call this meeting to an end. And unless anyone else on the panel has any follow-up to say?
Yes, I would, please, Julie. I just wanted to say thank you to so many in South Los Angeles. You got the notification for this meeting just a few hours ago. And I just appreciate the encouragement, the response, and your support and your presence. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you. And we very much appreciate you. I think that your comments and questions were thoughtful, and I think that Senator Wiener will be thinking about them the rest of the day, if not longer. So, okay, everyone. Well,
Testa, for
thanks
the opportunity. Julie, I want to say thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, again, we really appreciate having you as part of our coalition. So we'll see you, hopefully many of you, back next Sunday. We're going to have other speakers. We've got quite a few representatives that will be being scheduled in the near future. So we'll have some other really great conversations. This is not our normal format. We do not normally have a cutoff of 100. That was unfortunate. This was the first time working with this process, and we didn't realize that we would have that issue. So thanks again for joining us, and hope you come to our future meetings. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.